today is we're going to begin our final sort of section of the course. And this is going to be taking a look at learning phenomenon, other learning considerations that kind of go outside or build upon classical conditioning and operational conditioning. So we spend a lot of time on classical conditioning, one of the major forms of learning. We spend a lot of time on operational conditioning, one of the major forms of learning. And now we're going to start taking steps beyond that, building on those to understand even other further aspects, more higher order aspects of learning. And today we are going to start with our look at chapter 11 on observational learning. So what we'll cover today is we'll talk about or introduce the idea of observational or social learning. We'll take a look at observational learning in classical conditioning, so how classical conditioning plays into observational learning. We'll take a look at operational conditioning and how it plays into observational learning. Specifically, factors that affect whether you will learn how to do a behavior, and then factors that affect whether you will actually do that behavior. Those are two separate things. And then we'll see if we can apply what we learned to the idea of the bystander effect to see why the bystander effect might occur. All right, so we're going to begin with one of my favorite subjects, my daughter. So that is my daughter. She's currently 8. This was her when she was about 1.5. So we're going to show you what happened on a visit to the park that day. But before we do that, we need to talk about something else that I also enjoy, which is Shira. So we're going to talk about Shira, but not that Shira. We're going to talk about that Shira. And we're going to take a look at the intro for that cartoon back in 1985, I believe. All right, so I showed you that so I can show you this. So first off, while I'm switching over, that show is one of the, I think, best shows out of the 80s. I watched it with my daughter. This was at a time when producers thought that children will watch anything, so they would cheaply animate just the worst types of stories. And just to kind of show you how good Shira was, there was the first 5 episodes. For the first 2 episodes, you don't know that she's going to be Shira. So she's actually working for the Horde. I don't know if any of you watched the reboot, but she's actually working for the Horde at the beginning of the first 2 episodes. And the intro, they reanimated the intro where she said about how her name is Aurora and she is the captain of the Horde forces, and they're fighting against the rebel imperial uprising, or you know, it was just a real kind of outlier in terms of quality. Anyways, so we saw the intro to Shira. So I showed you that so I can show you this. I watched that with my daughter. Where'd you go? I watched that with my daughter. This is when, again, she was less than 2 years. She was about 1.5 years old. And we were at the park, and just out of nowhere, she grabs this stick, and she starts doing this with the stick. So I never taught her how to do this. I never showed her how to do this. She did it rather well because she magically transformed into Shira. No, she was Shira for Halloween. But the important thing is that this was a behavior that she had learned how to do, but nobody had ever reinforced her for this behavior. She had never lifted a stick before, and either me or her mom were like, oh, well done, very nice, ooh, look at that, oh, the stick's in the air. She was never reinforced for doing that, and yet, as a result of watching this cartoon, she replicated that behavior. So that's part of observational learning. That's an example of it. And we're going to see explanations for why did that occur as we go through today's class. We're also going to apply observational learning to the design and creation and how media works. Specifically, we're going to take a look at horror movies. So horror movies, we've brought these up before. If you've watched enough horror movies, you know that there are certain tropes, there are certain cliches, there's certain beats that you hit in a horror movie. And if you haven't seen Cabin in the Woods, this is almost like a love letter to fans of horror movies where they take all the tropes and they kind of subvert them. And I'm not going to spoil it if you haven't seen it yet. It does star Thor before he was big. But it kind of has all, it kind of hits all the beats. So if you're a fan of the slasher horror movie genre, and you see 5 teenagers go camping after being told by a gas station attendant, an older grizzled gas station attendant, not to go camping, you know they're not going to make it. But you probably have a good idea that one of them will survive. So hands up if you think that the arrogant jock is going to survive. So is he going to make it to the end of the film? Right. Okay. How about the science nerd? Is he going to make it to the end of the film? Maybe. Less, not a great chance. What about the promiscuous female? Is she making it to the end? No. No. The stoner? Is the drug user going to make it to the end? No. All right. What about the non-promiscuous virgin? Is she going to survive? Yes, she will. All right. So this kind of trope has been used over and over and over again, and we're going to focus on not the use of horror movies as morality tales in terms of don't do drugs, don't have premarital sex type stuff. But we're going to focus on why, number one, why is it that the female is typically your survivor? So this is a trope that has been used over and over again. It's called the final girl because it happens so often. So in Friday the 13th, he will plow through tons of camp counselors. One final survivor will make a stand, and that survivor will typically be a female character. So this has been played up in movies, The Last Final Girl. This has been analyzed in movie critiques in terms of why is the final girl there. And in his book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in Modern Horror Film, Carol Clover suggested that in these films, the viewer begins by sharing the perspective of the killer. So usually at the beginning of these films, you're rooting for the killer. That's one of the reasons they become so popular. But you experience a shift in identification to the final girl partway through the film. So at one point, you stop identifying with the murderer, the serial killer, and you start identifying with one of the protagonists. And in this case, you shift it to the final girl. So the question is going to be, why do you not shift it to the final boy? Why is it only final girls that make it to the end? And if that wasn't enough, we're also going to bring up another little pet peeve of mine, which is the Black Widow in the MCU. So we're going to see what happened to the Black Widow. It's kind of bizarre. It seems as if they never had a plan for the Black Widow. They didn't know how to use her. They didn't know what she was for. And I'm going to make an argument based on observational learning that she was there for one and one reason only, and she served her purpose, and then they just did not know what to do with her. And we're going to see what that reason is as we go through. All right, so a lot to do today. Let's get going. So observational learning is also called social learning. So we're going to call it observational learning here, but as you go on in psychology, you might come across social learning. Same exact thing, just by a different name. So observational learning is when the behavior of a model is witnessed by an observer. So you have the model who is doing the behavior, you have the observer who is witnessing the behavior, and then the observer's behavior is subsequently changed. So this is a new type of learning, so they're not being reinforced for learning, they're not being reinforced for producing a certain behavior. They just simply take a look at a model, so a model is doing a particular behavior, and that is witnessed by the observer, and in response to just seeing that behavior, the observer starts to perform that behavior. The behavior of the observer is changed. The observer learns to do something new, sheerly by observing a model. So that's observational learning at its core. So we're going to take a look at some effects of observational learning. We're going to take a look at some ways that observational learning changes our behavior. And one of those has to do with what is known as vicarious emotional responses. So a vicarious emotional response, this is when you have an emotional response that is similar to an observed emotion. So if you see happiness, we tend to feel better. If you see sadness, we tend to feel worse. If you see fear, we tend to feel frightened. Mm-hmm.
So like secondhand embarrassment would count as like a vicarious emotion.
Yeah, so if you ever felt embarrassed for somebody, right? So somebody does a social faux pas and they feel embarrassed, and then you're watching them and you yourself feel embarrassed, that's a vicarious emotional experience. Nothing has happened to you to make you feel embarrassed, but you just witnessed this other emotion and you feel a similar emotion. So again, if you see a model smiling, you will actually become happier. So that idea of, you want to make people feel better, just give them a smile. She had a smile that lit up the room. It literally did make the room feel better because the model is smiling and then the observer has a vicarious, similar emotional experience to feel happy. So the model smiling is the emotional response. The observer feeling happy is that vicarious emotional response. And it works the other way as well. So if you see the model and the model is having an emotional response, they are fearful, you will feel fear as well. So when you see somebody that's frightened, you can't help but feel a little bit frightened, a little bit worried yourself. So this vicarious emotional response, this has been used extensively in horror films. So the vicarious emotional response is exactly what horror films use to make the observer feel that vicarious emotional response, to make the observer feel fear. Because you're in a movie theater, you're safe, right? You're not in any sort of danger whatsoever, and yet you still feel frightened, yet you still feel scared. You're feeling that vicarious emotional response, and the way that they do it is by having models exhibit fearful responses on screen. So we're going to see that this is part of the reason why the final girl is usually the one that survives, because whereas all of these individuals will typically exhibit fear, we typically only identify with the final girl as being the final hero, the final protagonist of the story. So let's take a look at the kind of foundation of this, the way that it works. Let's reintroduce Pavlov's dog over here. So we haven't seen them in a while, but this is the way that it typically works in terms of classical conditioning. So we have model fear over here, and model fear when we are beginning out. So this is us as little children. This is us before we have learned this vicarious emotional response. This is us before we know anything about how to read people's faces. But a model's fear will typically occur to some frightening event, right? So when you're out with your parents and a wild animal starts running towards you, you better believe that your parents are going to start modeling some fear. So they model some fear, and you might take a look at that face and say, I have no idea what that means. It's a neutral stimulus. I don't feel anything. However, when you take a look at that frightening event that is coming at you, all teeth and claws, that's an unconditioned stimulus that is going to cause observer fear, the unconditioned response. So you will feel fear as a result of that fearful event, that unconditioned stimulus. Well, over time, because of the pairing of model fear, because we live in a social environment where people will react fearful to the same things, that model fear changes from being a neutral stimulus to being a conditioned stimulus. And this is the basis for the vicarious emotional response, because after repeated presentations of people's fear with a fearful event, you see the person's fear, you see the fearful event, that causes observer fear in yourself. Eventually, that model fear changes from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, at which point the model's fear by itself can now cause the conditioned response of observer fear. So that is the basis for why we have these vicarious emotional experiences, why we feel happy when other people feel happy, why we feel embarrassed when other people feel embarrassed, is because we have repeatedly paired their facial expressions, their emotional responses, with a unconditioned stimulus that happened to us, and thereby change those emotional expressions into a conditioned stimulus that causes a conditioned response of a similar emotion in us. All right, so far so good? All right, so how does this relate to horror movies? Horror movies will use this model fear, and they're going to use it in higher order conditioning. So what they have in movies is they have this opportunity to use this higher order conditioning, to take this model fear, this conditioned stimulus, number one, that causes observer fear, and then to use that to condition a new neutral stimulus. And that new neutral stimulus is typically a movie character. So movie character becomes your neutral stimulus number two. And when you kind of just take a look at movie characters in general, oftentimes they are not that scary when you break them down. All right, overalls in a hockey mask is not that scary. If you saw a person in overalls in a hockey mask, you would probably think there's somebody who can't afford real hockey equipment but is going to play goalie for, for their friends. You wouldn't think, oh my gosh, serial killer, I gotta be super scared. So a lot of these movie characters start off as pretty much neutral stimuli. And they would lead to no observer fear. So if you said, hey, take a look at these blue overalls and this hockey mask, what do you think? You'd be like, poor guy can't afford real hockey equipment. It would be a neutral stimulus. What they do in the movie is they continually pair that neutral character with model fear. So they will have scene after scene where the characters in the movie encounter this movie character, and all of a sudden they're like, oh no, and then they get murdered. Even if they don't, they'll be scared, they'll run away, they'll be terrified for their lives, they'll have fearful expressions on their face. And over, when that is presented, you see that movie character, and it's a neutral stimulus. However, you see that model fear, you see that character freaking out, showing those fearful behaviors, and that model fear on its own causes the conditioned response of observer fear, because that's how we learned that vicarious emotional experience. After repeated presentations, pretty soon, that movie character becomes a conditioned stimulus that then can, on its own, cause observer fear in the individual. So if you take a look at the effects of somebody in a hockey mask on the general public, it's going to be a neutral stimulus. You take a look at the effect of a hockey mask on somebody who has just watched one of the good Friday the 13th movies, and they're going to jump, they're going to freak out, they're going to see it, they're going to be like, oh, that is this conditioning, changing that movie character into a conditioned stimulus. So the last question then becomes, and I'll turn this over to everybody here to see some suggestions. Why is it that it's the female character that is typically the survivor? Why is it that it's not the final person? Why is it that it's the final girl? Or you can also think of it in terms of why is it not the final male? So again, that idea of the final girl happens over and over and over and over and over. One of the classic final girls from Halloween. And even in not straight up horror movies, somehow, it's the final girl that makes it out. So any speculations why it's the female characters that get that reversal where you're rooting for the killers at the beginning, but then at the end you're rooting for the protagonist, and why it's a woman typically? Mm-hmm.
Because women are often associated with innocence.
That is part of it. So women are associated with innocence. So any other kind of, it's on that note, yeah?
I kind of think of like how knights have to go rescue the maid, and that has been like a constant story throughout society. So
Okay, so how knights have to rescue the maiden. What does a knight typically have? Armor. What are the other attributes? Bravery. You had.
I have a different idea.
Okay, well, what's your different idea?
So girls tend to be seen as weaker than men, and it's always a really cool plot twist when the weakling becomes the underdog and overtakes whatever is the most dominant presence. So even though it is a stereotype trope for like the final girl, it's always going to take us by surprise in some fashion or another because you don't expect it.
Yeah. So all of those ideas are basically part of the same explanation. So that author of gender issues and chainsaws in horror films basically pointed out that in each of these situations, in each of these movies, we'll go over here. So if you've seen Scream 2, all of these individuals are being used as conditioned stimuli. All of them see the ghost face killer, all of them freak out, all of them show fear in their face, and that helps condition us to experience the conditioned response of observer fear. What happens though is that she will show fear, and he will show fear, and she will show fear, and he will show fear, and she will show fear. And because of, it was suggested, and you guys were right, it's the idea that women in our society are allowed to show fear and then become the hero, whereas males in our society are not allowed to show fear. That disqualifies them from being the hero. So knights saving the maiden, common trope. What do we know about knights? They're brave. Knights have bravery. As soon as you don't have bravery as a male, you are no longer worthy of being that hero. So that switch from scared individual, fearful individual, to the eventual hero of the piece, really in our society typically only happens if you have a female character who can be accepted as being innocent and fearful. She can then make the switch to having the power in the situation, whereas a male, as soon as they show that they're fearful, is disqualified from actually shifting into the powerful situation. And if you take a look at male survivors in horror films, and this is a great example of it. If you've taken a look at the Scream franchise, you know the character played by David Arquette. Has anybody seen the Scream franchises? All right, you will know that he is indestructible, right? In this film, he's like super heroic, indestructible individual. He is also played for laughs. You cannot take him seriously. He's not the hero, he's there for comic relief. So you can show fear and survive in a horror film as a male, as long as you're the comic relief. If you're not the comic relief, well, I should have said spoiler alert, but this is more than a few years old, you're toast. So basically, this is the idea that we would accept Jamie Lee Curtis as the final heroine, even though she showed fear during the movie. We will accept Sigourney Weaver as the heroine in the Alien series. Who we will not accept is, I believe his name was Bill Pullman, the one Marine who was like, game over, man, it's over, we're dead, game over, man. He doesn't survive. He doesn't, because he showed fear. He's not allowed to be the hero. And this is what I think is the real reason that Black Widow was in the Avengers. So why was she put into this film? If you know comic book history, if you know the comic book characters, it makes even less sense than it does just standing on its own, because number one, she has been a member of the Avengers in the comics, but somebody else who was also a member of the Avengers was the Wasp. So Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, she was a member of the Avengers. Not only was she a member of the Avengers, she was a founding member of the Avengers. So she was one of the first Avengers. So when they debuted back in the 60s, there she is right there with Ant-Man. She was one of the first. So if you're going to introduce a female character into the Avengers, why not choose one of the ones that was there first? Why not choose one of the, actually the first female leader of the Avengers. So when they were kind of dealing with leadership in the Avengers, she was the first one. You can see here, thank you, Cap, I nominate myself. And basically all these arguments and her shutting down everyone, and they were like, you know what, yeah, let's have you as the leader. Why was the Wasp not in Avengers? Why did they choose the Black Widow? And just to drive this point home a little bit more, we'll take a look at just how out of place. You can tell this is a little pet peeve of mine. We'll take a look at just how out of place she was in this trailer for the Avengers. So enjoy this intro trailer to the Avengers film. All right, so I'm gonna pause it right there, go back a little bit to the group shot. So up until now, we know that she can do a spin kick, right? That's what we saw in the trailer. Everybody else has been, you know they're powerful. You know that Iron Man's got a suit of armor. We've seen Thor bring down the thunder. We've seen Captain America punch out a punching bag and engage in fights with everybody. We've seen the Hulk save Iron Man and tear up a building. And we've seen Black Widow do a spinning kick and say that she can persuade people, and also that she hasn't been trained properly, right? I mean, that's what she said right here. But just to drive that point home, look at the group shot when they kind of put all of them together. All right, so you got the Incredible Hulk, right? Earth's mightiest mortal, right? Strongest there is. We got Iron Man, right? High-tech suit of armor. We got Hawkeye with his trick arrows and explosive devices. We got Thor wielding Mjolnir, the most powerful weapon in the universe. We got the Black Widow with a gun she bought at Walmart. And Captain America with his adamantium shield. One of those things is not like the other, right? So hopefully that proves my point. So why was she there?
I'm bringing the party to you.
Oh, and remember that. All right, that scene also. Take a look at what Tony says. Take a look at how the Black Widow reacts.
Hi, I'm bringing the party to you.
All right, so he's bringing the party to them. Super calm, super collective. She's the one that's looking up going, oh no. What is he doing? So even in here, you can see a bright little glimpse. What would be rational at this point would be for Tony Stark to say things like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I need people to save me. I'm being chased by this huge destructive force. Hulk, anyone? Is anyone there that, no. But what does he get? Guys, I'm bringing the party to you. So what was all this kind of in service to? What do we have to analyze this? What is the point of the Black Widow in these Avengers movies? Well, if you kind of know the history of these movies, you will know that at this point, they had established Iron Man. He already had 2 movies under his belt, including Iron Man 2, where Black Widow was introduced. Thor had already been established. Captain America had already been established. There was just one Avenger that really didn't have a presence yet, and that was the Hulk. So the Hulk had a failed movie outside of the MCU, which was seen by basically nobody. And then he also had a failed movie inside the MCU that was also seen by basically nobody. And you will know that in the history of their universe, this movie is almost ignored. So Edward Norton was replaced by Mark Ruffalo. Liv Tyler, gone. Nobody knows what happened, to Betty Ross. The most you get is William Hurt with the occasional cameo of being Thunderbolt Ross. But this was a commercial failure. It's hard to believe, but it was. And because of that, nobody really knew who the Hulk was. Nobody knew about the Hulk. Nobody knew what his powers were. Nobody knew how much of a menace he was. And they needed a quick way to establish the fact that he was very dangerous, and that quick way was the Black Widow. So we'll take a look at the scene, which I believe is the only reason that the Black Widow was written into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it's this scene right here. So this happens when they're on the SHIELD helicarrier, and the Hulk has not transformed yet. This is the first time we're going to see the Hulk and they need a quick way of establishing that he is frightening, he is powerful, and you're going to see that they're going to use the Black Widow and observational learning to do it. All right, so pay attention to her face in this entire scenario. Not once is she ever say, guys, I'm bringing the party to you. Oh, by the way, the Hulk has changed, and I'm bringing the party to you. All right, watch her face. There is no, oh, guys, by the way, I'm being chased by a rampaging Hulk, and I'm bringing the party to you. There's none of that. What there is massive amounts of fear. All right, so that was Thor. And look at her now. It's a little hard to see. Look at her face now. She is terrified, right? Absolutely terrified. Barely holding it together. All right, so she was absolutely terrified in that final, you know, after encountering the Hulk, which I might add is the right response, right? So everybody else who, you know, isn't experiencing that when you're coming up against the Hulk, there's something not quite rational, not quite right about how your mind is working. But that was why she was in the MCU. That's why they incorporated her into this story. I think they needed a way to make sure that they established the Hulk as a viable threat. So when you see that face in reaction to the Hulk, when you see this previously neutral stimulus, and then you see this conditioned stimulus of a fearful face, you can't help but observe or fear, and that helped to establish the Hulk as the threat that he was. And just to kind of give you some anecdotal evidence about how effective that scene was, I took my nephew to see the Avengers. He must have been like 10 years old, 9, 10 years old at the time. And this was the one scene he grabbed my arm. This was the one time he was kind of like, woo. And it was extremely effective, and to see her that fearful. The Wasp would have just shrunk down and flew away. Right? It would have been problem solved. She wouldn't have been vulnerable in that situation. So again, it was that use of this conditioned fear, this fearful expression, which is a conditioned stimulus that evokes the vicarious response in us of observer fear, which was then paired with this previously neutral, no longer neutral stimulus of the Hulk, which then led the Hulk to be a conditioned stimulus where we were very impressed, we were very in awe, we were very experienced that sort of fear about the fact that he is so incredibly powerful. And just as one more sort of piece of evidence, sometimes I have to convince people that this was the actual intent of the Black Widow. Iron Man 2 came out, I want to make sure I got my dates right, came out 2010. Black Widow is getting her first movie in 2020. That's 10 years between the it's a prequel. Yeah. Spoiler alert. In between the introduction of her character to the point where she's getting her first movie, I don't think any solo movie has ever taken that long, right? So it didn't happen to the Black Panther, it didn't happen to Doctor Strange. I mean, that kind of gap is longest because I don't think they had plans for her other than let's make sure that we have a female character who can show that fear to the Hulk to establish the Hulk as this threat that he is. And again, this goes back to that idea of the final girl, because we would not accept any of the male characters as heroes. It is changing a little bit, but any of the male characters as heroes if they had shown that particular fear. So any questions or comments on the use of the Black Widow as that classical conditioning using vicarious emotional experiences as that observational learning tool? All right, I didn't even have to get the fat Thor. We didn't even have to mention this. This is also one of my pet peeves because you will notice that throughout the entire Avengers Endgame, Captain America is heroic. Captain America gets a nice sentimental send-off. Through the entire movie, actually no, Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man is one of those exceptions because he does show a lot of emotion at the beginning, and yet he is one of the big heroes. I don't know if that's just because he's a great actor, but Thor being used for comedy purposes when he is clearly suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, it's just, it was just, anyways. That was a bit. Okay, so that was observational learning in classical conditioning. We are now going to take a look at observational learning in operational conditioning. So in operant conditioning, where your behavior has a consequence, not just paired association, but where your behavior actually has a consequence, there's also a role that is played by observational learning. And it has to do with the acquisition portion of learning and the performance portion of learning. So acquisition, when we're talking about it in observational learning, this is gaining knowledge of how to actually do the behavior. So this is learning how to do the behavior. So you see somebody do the behavior, and then you're like, oh, now I know how to do that behavior. That's the acquisition part of observational learning. The performance part is the actual doing of the behavior. So acquisition is learning how to do the behavior, and then the performance part is actually doing the behavior. So you have to have both in order for the behavior to be produced. So you have to learn how to do the behavior first, and then you actually have to want to or intend to do the behavior. So if you have acquisition with no performance, you'd be sitting there going, oh, I know how to lift this stick, but I have no desire to lift this stick, I'm not going to do it. So you would have acquisition, but no performance. If you had performance but no acquisition, you would be like, I would love to lift that stick, but I have no idea how to lift that stick. You need the both of them in order to do the behavior. So we're going to take a look at acquisition and performance and issues with that. And we're going to once again go back to Shira, and we're going to try to solve the following questions. So my daughter watched this show with me, and again, one day she just picked up that stick, reached it to the sky. She was never reinforced for doing that. We never taught her how to raise, the sword like Shira did. But interestingly, there are other characters in that show that she did not imitate. So she did imitate Shira. And if you're familiar with the show, there are 3 characters that got tons of screen time in the Shira show. There was Shira, the heroine. There was Bo, the damsel in distress, and he got a lot of time. And then there was Hordak, he was the villain. So the 3 of those were all present for a large portion of time. Yet, my daughter modeled this behavior. She did not pretend that she had a bow. She did not pretend that she could magically change her extremities into, ray guns or other forms of weapons. She basically imitated Shira. She went through observational learning for Shira, but not for Bo and not for Hordak. So the question then becomes, why did that occur specifically for Shira? And we're going to try to answer that using ideas of acquisition and performance. So acquisition, first off, there are factors that affect acquisition. This is the first one, the consequences of the model's behavior. So you are more likely to go through acquisition. You're more likely to learn how to do a particular behavior if the consequences of the model's behavior are positive, if they're beneficial. If the consequences of the model's behavior are not beneficial, I'm not going to use positive or negative because those are loaded. We're meaning positive in the societal sense. If the consequences of the model's behavior are beneficial to the model, you're more likely to go through acquisition. If the consequences of the model's behavior are detrimental to the model, if the model is punished for doing those behaviors, then you're less likely to go through acquisition. And this is reason number 1 why she imitated Shira. She went through observational learning with Shira rather than the other individuals. So Hordak is a villain. And in 1980s cartoons, at the end of the 22 minutes, he was defeated every single time. So Hordak was, well, there was one exception, but Hordak was defeated every single time. His behaviors were punished, so that makes it less likely that his behaviors would be imitated. Bo was punished less, but again, he was that sort of manzel in distress. He would get into trouble, Shiro would come and save him. So his behavior was also not as successful. It also was not reinforced. So his behavior was not reinforced. It didn't end with positive consequences. It was Shira who was reinforced. So when she did a behavior, she raised her sword, she changed into Shira. She punched the villain went down. She kicked the door flew down. She was reinforced for her behaviors, which made it more likely that Isabella would observationally learn from her as a model. So that's one of the first factors, consequences of the model's behavior. The second one is reinforcement for attending to the model. So this is where the observer is actually reinforced by other people, in this case, the parents, for attending to the model rather than attending to other models. So, for example, when we were watching this show together, at no point did I go to Isabella and say, oh, do you see how Hordak is oppressing the villagers? Isn't that, yeah, let's pay attention to that. That's a good thing to do, right? No, but when Shira did something right, you would be like, oh yeah, let's pay attention here. Yeah, well that's good paying attention. She's doing the right thing here. She's helping out people. She's being heroic. That's the right thing to do. So she definitely wouldn't have been reinforced for paying attention to Hordak and Hordak's behavior. She would have been reinforced for both Shira and Bo. Both of them had heroic behaviors. Both of them have good, good attributes. She probably wouldn't have been reinforced for watching Bo leap into dangerous situations. He would probably have been told he should wait for Shira to come by. But anyways, she definitely would have been primarily reinforced for paying attention to this model by other individuals. So reinforcement for attending to the model is another factor for acquisition, another explanation of why Shira's behavior was reproduced, whereas the other two were not. All right, next one, skills to benefit from the actual modeling. So this one has more to do with why Shira and not Bo, but you actually need to have the basic skills in order to benefit from observing how to do something. So you can learn a lot from observing individuals as long as you have a certain level of basic skills to build on, right? So if we were to go into a hospital observation room right now and watch an open heart surgery, we would probably not acquire very many skills about how to perform open heart surgery. But you take medical students in their residency and they're watching somebody perform open heart surgery, based on their basic skills, they can get a lot out of that observation. They can have a lot of acquisition. So you need the skills to benefit from the modeling. When this occurred, she was about 1.5 years old, as I said, and lifting a stick is a lot easier to do, is a lot more straightforward than the compound movement of holding out a bow and pulling back your other arm. So shooting a bow is way more complicated than just lifting a sword, and that would be another factor why this model's behavior was imitated, because Isabella's skills at that time, her motor skills at that time, allowed for this behavior to be acquired, whereas this one was still a little bit, further along. So like I said, just lifting that stick, very simple behavior. That was the behavior modeled by Shira. Pulling on a bow, much more complicated behavior. That was the behavior that was modeled by Bo. She benefited and acquired skills from watching Shira lift her sword, did not benefit or acquire those skills from watching Bo shoot his arrow. All right, I believe there is one more. Oh yeah, this one sort of shocked me as well. Personal characteristics of the model. And this one is extremely important. So the personal characteristics of the model the more your identity and your characteristics match up with the characteristics of the model, the more likely you are to engage in acquisition. So the personal characteristics of the model, the more they line up with your own identity, the more you are going to benefit or have acquisition from that model's behavior. And this was just really interesting because even at 1.5 years old, Isabella somehow recognized that who she is has more in common with Shira than with Bo or Kordak. There was something about Shira that she identified with, and she said, there's an individual that has the characteristics that I have, and that made her more likely to do the behavior of Shira instead. All right, so does anybody, for this one, the personal characteristics, comments yet?
Do you think that that's also, like, especially with kids, why they favor certain, like, movies or shows or something because of the personal characteristics?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, there's this, just speaking of tropes and cliches, there's this really kind of tired cliche for adults if you're watching cartoons with your children, and that is the inclusion of a child character. So if you take a look at a lot of shows that have adult characters, adult heroes, so if you take a look at things like, the Justice League, it's all grown adults, but they will go out of their way to introduce that teenage sidekick. They will introduce Robin, they'll introduce, they'll de-age Cyborg, they'll introduce basically anybody from the Teen Titans to get that one child in there. And the idea is that, again, based on this observational learning, is that the children will pay attention to the child because somehow they identify as more like them. And this is also, just to tie it back, I don't have a slide for this, but this is also why I believe the least terrifying Disney villain of all time, if I had a comment section, you could go after me in the comments on this, but I think one of the least threatening ones of all time is, I can't even remember her name, that's how unthreatening she is, the woman from The Rescuers. Yeah. So she is just a person. She's got no magical skills. She can't even get herself together in the morning. Like, her pantyhose is falling all off, her makeup is horrible, I think her dress keeps coming off, she keeps having to pull it up. Does anybody know? We're getting Google confirmation here right now. But she is very, very unthreatening. When you take a look at the pantheon of Disney villains, you got Maleficent up here in the stratosphere, and you have whatever her name is down here. And it kind of goes Maleficent, it kind of goes Ursula, I'll put Jafar up there, there's this sort of sliding scope. Somebody has to do an analysis of this. If anybody wants to join me on this, feel free. I personally think that the threat of the villain is going to be directly correlated to the age of the main protagonist. So if you take a look at princesses like Aurora, she just turned 16, I believe it was her 16th birthday, right? You take a look at, Jasmine, I think Jasmine was 18. You take a look at all these princesses that are fighting these horrible, horrible monstrosities, they're all in their either adult or teenage years. You take a look at the Rescuers, and that was the one time I think that they had a little child in peril. They had Penny. Penny was something like 5 at the most, right? So I believe that they sort of identify that a child watching that film, because of this observational learning, would be more likely to experience intense fear when they see what Penny's going through, because they identify more characteristics with her. She's a child, they're a child. She's small, they're small. Aurora's a princess, I'm not a princess. Aurora just turned 16, I'm 7, right? You don't have those same characteristics, and I think that's why that villain, she is effective, but is nowhere near the powerhouse that other villains are. And again, it's that idea of the personal characteristics of the model.
Sorry,
Yep.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think, but do you think also this social learning or observational learning would also, does it just happen naturally, or do you think it's intentional? by like creators. Do you know what I mean? Like, is this something that we just kind of like become conditioned to and just naturally do, or do you think it's strategic?
Well, I think many of the aspects of it are just natural.
Yeah.
So reinforcement works, and then consequences of the model's behavior ties into, are they being reinforced? So that's operant learning. And then also, we're learning from them as a conditioned stimulus, so that's classical conditioning. Reinforcement for attending to the model, that's just reinforcement. Skills to benefit from the modeling, that's your kind of whatever skills you have at the time. But this personal characteristics of the model, I would argue that because it tends to occur so young, it would just be something that's innate in our natures, that we tend to observe, we tend to identify more with people that have characteristics like we do. Yep.
Do you think that people who see themselves represented on TV in this way, but maybe in like a negative light, do you think that it still affects them the same? Like, I don't know how to.
No, I know exactly what you're saying, and I think yes, I think you're exactly right. I think it's the same kind of observational learning. You go through acquisition, and you go through performance, and that's one of the main reasons why I think that the current push for diversity in entertainment, right? You take a look at Marvel's Phase 4 plans, and it's literally just, you know, diversity across the board. They have their first Asian American hero. They have female-led movies. They have, you know, the second Black Panther movie is coming up. They have all of this sort of diversity in there. And it should, I mean, it's one of those things about, one of those kind of issues where it shouldn't be like this, but it is like this. So, you know, when you're growing up, you learn a lot of what is right and wrong from our culture, and a lot of our culture is expressed through its entertainment. People don't like to think that we've learned stuff from watching movies and TV, but it's true. We've learned our values, we've learned what's right, what's wrong from watching, portrayals in the media. You know, when you see a Superman movie and you see Superman standing up, you know, for what's right, it makes you, from observing that, more likely to stand up for what's right. It makes you more likely to say, you know what, this situation is wrong. And while you're not in your head going, you know, what would Superman do? You can't help but learn from that, right? So I'm sure when Isabella was seeing that stick, she wasn't necessarily thinking to herself, what would Shira do in this situation? But watching that behavior over and over again made her more likely to up and lift that stick. So whereas, while everybody should be able to learn from Superman, right? Every child should be able to go to, maybe not Zack Snyder's Superman, but every child should be able to, let's go to Captain America. Every child should be able to take a look at a Captain America movie and say, oh, he stood up for what was right, so that's going to make me more likely to stand up for what's right. He did this even though he was, you know, it was a long shot, so that's going to make me, you know, dream big and take the long shots. That should happen. Psychology here says it doesn't, right? It just doesn't work that way. So this whole push for diversity, I think, is psychologically very important because you need those good role models, right? Like Wonder Woman was an important movie because all of these little girls who were sitting there going, I just don't identify with Superman. You might sit there and say, you know what, sweetie, that's kind of sexist. You know, like, why aren't you identifying with Superman? Is it just because he's a man? And is it, you know, well, yeah, I guess a little bit, but that's the way we're wired. So Wonder Woman as a role model, if you take a look at a Comic-Con and you take a look at who was in line to see Gal Gadot, it was just tons of little girls in their Wonder Woman costumes waiting to see their hero, learning about what it is that you should do because they identified with that individual. Yep.
Is this spoiler why there's so many different Spider-Mans?
Yeah, I would say that's part of the reason why I think it's successful, why there's so many different Spider-Man. So you have Miles Morales, the Hispanic African-American Spider-Man. You have Gwen Stacy, the female Spider-Man. You actually have Spider-Woman, another female Spider-Man. there's tons of this kind of push for diversity, and I think it's important because that's just the way that things work. And you can argue whether it's ethical or whether it's other things, but psychologically, it's part of how we learn. It's observational learning. The more we see in common with individuals, both good and bad, the more likely we are to mimic their behavior, both good and bad. So that kind of ties into this example here. So if you remember Miley Cyrus, she hasn't really released anything else in a little while, but there was a couple of instances when she was shown at concerts, I believe in Amsterdam somewhere, she was shown smoking marijuana. And people went ballistic, right? They went crazy. They were like, oh my gosh, how could she do this? Doesn't she know what she's doing? How could she, do this, given her popularity? And yet nobody cares when Willie Nelson has marijuana. So the question is, why? And it has to do with that acquisition and the observer characteristics. So you are more likely to learn and acquire, and as we're going to see, we're going to save it for next time, you're more likely to perform the behavior of doing drugs if you identify or have the characteristics of Willie Nelson given this behavior, and you're more likely to do drugs and learn how to do it if you have the characteristics of Miley Cyrus. And nobody wrote an article and said, won't somebody please think of the impact that Willie Nelson is having on our elderly male population. These poor 70-year-old males are being influenced to do drugs because they see what... Nobody thought that, because everybody knew that there were no young teenagers, or very few young teenagers, looking at this saying, oh, that makes it seem like a really good idea. Miley Cyrus does it, and all of a sudden, the entire demographic shifts. People that have more in common with Miley Cyrus, that is young individuals, that is young females, because of this, are way more likely to start smoking marijuana than they ever would be from seeing Willie Nelson. So that ties into that idea of the personal characteristics of the model, and it works for good behavior and for bad behavior. That's why every single time a minority is portrayed in a negative manner in media, people get upset. People are like, well, why? They're being villainized, they're being dehumanized, they're being defamed, right? The Anti-Defamation League start popping up. And it's true, because if they're being overly represented in that way, then because of this, all their viewers are being overly taught to do that particular behavior through observational learning. All right, are there any other comments or questions before we kind of wrap up for today? Okay, so we're going to finish our look at this. Next time we're going to take a look at performance, but that is our time for today. We'll save that for next time. So